Bread, one of the most familiar foods in today's world. It appears in one form or another in almost every single meal we eat. Toast or an English muffin at breakfast, bread for your sandwich at lunch, rolls with your dinner, and many of our favorite desserts are bread-based. Why? How did bread become such a large part of our daily lives? Where did it come from? That's what we're going to look into today. It's not so surprising that bread has remained such an integral part of our lives. From the beginning, bread has been a staple part of our diets through numerous cultures and across the ages. Bread is part of what makes us human. The best way to learn about bread is to make some, so I'm going to be walking you through creating a basic artisanal loaf. This particular style of bread is as close as the average modern baker can get to recreating one of those ancient loaves. It has no kneading and is incredibly beautiful. The only specialized piece of equipment we will be using is a Dutch oven, but it's not necessary. You can just use any oven-safe pot, and if you don't have an oven-safe lid, you can use tin foil. So let's get started. We're going to start by exploring the fundamentals of bread and its origins. Every basic bread recipe since the beginning uses the same 4 ingredients: flour, salt, yeast, and water. Let's look a little closer at the most important of these ingredients, flour, and its historical significance. Now that we know a little more about where bread began, let's start making our bread. We start with 3 cups of flour. I'm using generic all-purpose, but you can use any kind of wheat flour you like. Just keep in mind, higher density flours like whole wheat or coarse multigrain will create a denser loaf, which, interestingly enough, would be more similar to those first loaves of bread. Next is 2 teaspoons of salt. I recommend kosher sea salt, but any kind of salt will do. Then we have half a teaspoon of yeast. This is going to let our bread rise. And lastly, we have 1.5 cups of lukewarm water. This is a very simple dough, very similar to how bread has been made for millennia. We're going to simply put everything into the bowl and mix it together until it's all incorporated. Then we'll just cover it up and let it rise slowly over the next several hours. This particular bread takes between 12 to 24 hours to rise, very similar to ancient bread baking. The long rising process is partially why there was so much cultural and spiritual significance became attached to bread throughout the years, as well as why it eventually became a separate profession, because most people didn't want to do this in their homes if they didn't have to. One of the best places we see examples of this is in ancient Egypt. Let's check in on our bread and see how it's doing. Our dough has been rising for the past 16 hours and has transformed from a rather tough, shaggy dough to a gooey, bubbly dough full of air bubbles. This happens because the yeast feasts on the carbohydrates in the hydrated flour and produces carbon dioxide. This creates large air bubbles, causing the dough to rise. This process makes it possible to create a large amount of bread from a small amount of ingredients. This was especially important for large civilizations with large populations to feed. The largest and most significant empire to the Western civilization was, of course, Rome. They were the originators of the concept of Western civilization and are directly responsible for many of the aspects of our everyday lives, from language to politics to food. And Rome has always loved bread. Now that our bread has risen, it's time to put it in the oven and bake it. Preheat the oven to 450 and put the bottom of your Dutch oven or other oven-safe pot in to heat up. While the oven preheats, shape your dough into a round and let it sit on the counter. Once the oven is preheated, carefully take your pot out of the oven, put the dough inside, and put the oven-safe lid on, and stick it back into the oven. It'll cook for 30 minutes covered and another 5 to 10 minutes uncovered. The ease of modern baking has its roots in the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages saw the development of the modern baking industry itself to what we know today. Partially, it's because the types of bread consumed were often a defining characteristic of one's social standing in medieval society. Let's look at this a little bit closer. Our bread is fully baked and ready to enjoy, and hopefully we've learned a few things about why bread is such a special part of history. My challenge to you is to try and make your own loaves of bread. Become a part of this millennia-long tradition of baking and you won't be disappointed. Thank you for joining me today, and happy baking!